in the middle, and etc., etc. Don't worry about that. Just pile up in your mind all the marvelous things of the world that makes people happy. We offer them to the Buddha as a request. Saji perki juxing metog tramri rablingji ni de genpadi sange jingdu mikte urwai drokon namdrag jing na chapashog. And now we imagine the Buddha very happily receives our offering. The mantra is not here, it should be there. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And now, do you have the refuge prayer, Catherine? There we go. Perfect. So this other prayer is two parts. The first two lines are for those of us who already think we are Buddhists, who've kind of committed ourselves to being Buddhists. So it's reiterating our reliance on the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha. And then the second two lines are stating our purpose, our motivation, as the Lamas would say. So as it says there, by the merit I create from listening to this Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. That's the most expansive motivation you could have, the most long term, you know. So we're thinking this way. Sangye charang soke chognam la jancho badu dagni kyap suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penche sangye drupa shog sangye charang soke chognam la jancho badu dagni kyap suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penche sangye drupa shog Sangye charang soke chognam la jancho badu dagni kyap suchi dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki drola penche sangye drupa sho. Okay, thank you. All right, so okay. So this idea is, again, like we talked last week, I presented a bit the whole Lam Rim last week, and I really can't stress this enough, you know, that it's the teachings are gradual. The teachings are incremental, like any body of knowledge. You've got to remember this, but we're not used to thinking this way with spiritual teachings. And we discussed this last week. Any body of knowledge, you've got to start at the simple stuff, and you go to the middle stuff, and you go to the most advanced stuff, and then you graduate. And it's exactly like this here. This way the Tibetans have packaged the teachings. It's really quite unique, you know. And once we understand it, initially it just seems very abstract, all these weird ideas all plonked together. We can't see how it's orderly. We can't see that. But then when we begin to understand it, it's a real revelation, you know, because that means every Dharma book you pick up, every philosophical text, any of the most complex, you know, philosophy, metaphysics, psychology, you name it. You pick it up and you read and you know exactly where it fits. This is really kind of very powerful and very helpful. So the other thing is, mostly we will think about Buddhism as being about compassion. People love about the idea of compassion. But compassion is not enough, as His Holiness said, because compassion is the more advanced. Compassion is university level. It's a way to put it. You've got to have wisdom, and wisdom is the nuts and bolts of Buddha's teachings. So if we don't start at the very beginning by controlling our body, controlling our speech, understanding karma, like we talked last week, and if we don't then go to the next level and start to become our own therapist and look into our mind and unpack it, unravel it, and see how all the delusions are, and all of this work mainly is what brings what they call renunciation, which is a very boring word, a very forbidding word to us. As Lama Zopa says, we get very confused when we hear the Buddha says we've got to give up attachment. We think, oh, I've got to give up my heart. I've got to give up my happiness. We don't hear it properly, you know. So the first stages of practice are all about yourself. They're not about other people yet. You leave people alone, in fact. Back off and mind your own business and leave sentient beings in peace. That's the first stages of practice. You're controlling your body, speech, and mind. Why? Because everything you think and do and say leaves imprints in your mind that'll ripen as your future suffering. And guess what, honey? You don't want suffering. We only want happiness. So this is what drives the first stages of practice. That's what renunciation means. So we miss this, and it's very common for us in the West to miss this. We say, oh, that sounds selfish, you know. We don't get it at all. We have to have this fierce understanding, this deep understanding of what suffering is using Buddha's view and its causes, and want to get the hell out of it. That's renunciation. And what that brings isn't some kind of depressed, unhappy person. This is what brings happiness, you know. This is what helps us stabilize our body, speech, and mind. We become more disciplined. We get some self-respect. We get some self-confidence. We're not up and down like yo-yos every day. We're harnessing our anger, our attachment, our neuroses. We're more courageous. I mean, you become a marvelous person It doesn't seem evident to us when we read the teachings. It sounds very forbidding. Give up this and give up that, and we've got anger, we've got attachment, and blah, blah, blah. It sounds depressing, but we've got to hear it properly, I tell you. Then we're ready for the compassion wing. So this first level of compassion wing is where the culmination of it, the first stages of it, and we talked about this last week, the practice of equanimity, this fundamental, this basis, this starting point on the next stages of practice, this recognition that enemies and friends and strangers are the same from one point of view. They want to be happy and don't want to suffer. This is fundamentally necessary to understand as a starting point on the compassion wing. And it culminates in bodhicitta. And the final stages of the compassion wing are the 6 perfections of the bodhisattva. But we're in the section where we're aiming to become bodhisattvas. So the point is, from all the way from beginning stages all the way to Buddhahood, the job never changes. And this is something really important to understand. The job of being a Buddhist is working on your mind. The job of being a Buddhist is unpacking and unraveling and deconstructing and then reconstructing your cognitive process into this marvelous mind of virtue and wisdom. That's the job of being a Buddhist, all the way from here to Buddhahood. Again, that doesn't seem evident to us, you know. So the emphasis in the first stages of practice are to back off and leave sentient beings in peace, please, and control your body, speech, and mind and stop harming them. Why? Not because of compassion yet. A negative action, a heavy negative action for Buddha, as we discussed last week, is one that's defined as an action that harms another. But the reason Buddha exhorts us not to do it is because it'll harm me. And that's really what we miss in the West. We don't get this. We don't like the idea of karma. So we miss it, you know. But unless we've got that understanding of the Four Noble Truths and what suffering is and what its causes are, and want to wish the hell to get out of suffering and its causes, until we understand this, we can't have proper compassion. We just can't. It's too limited. Because we're so addicted to thinking the compassion is just for a few people, your beloveds and a few victims, you know, mostly animals and children. That's about it. No, Buddha says, every single sentient being in the universe, from the psychopaths to the saints, want to be happy and don't want to suffer. So on the compassion, when we start with equanimity, this recognition, this using logic to argue with ego's misconceptions, not just some gooey feeling. And this, what we're doing with getting equanimity, is shifting the reason for why we want to love somebody and why we want to have compassion. So love is, like I said last week, love is defined as the thought, may you be happy. Compassion is defined as the thought, may you not suffer. And they grow hugely, of course, into love and compassion. Well, we want it for every sentient being. So we've got to see the logic. What's the logic of this? Right now, the illogic that ego uses is I'm only going to love my beloveds, the ones who make me happy, and that's called our friends. You know? And then I don't want to love the ones who've been mean to me, my enemies. In fact, I have to struggle not to hate them. And I simply couldn't care less about 99.99% of the universe, which is labeled strangers. So a friend, by definition, using this framework, is a person who does what my attachment wants. And it sounds very brutal, but this is exactly right. And for that person, I have love and compassion, bucket loads of it, but only for that group. Then the middle group, the anger, the aversion, I mean, the enemy, you know, like I said, is not necessarily a label we use, but it's the object of our aversion. They're the ones who consciously, actively have not done what my attachment wants, or who not even consciously, they just annoy me. I don't like that person, you know, then they're in the enemy category, for whom I have aversion and whom I do not love and whom I do not have compassion for. And the third category, how do I feel about them? Complete and total indifference. And why? What's the logic of ego? There's no logic really. Ego's logic is because they've neither harmed nor helped me. So that's the universe, you know, and this is the universe for everybody in the universe, and nobody questions this. You're not considered selfish if you don't love enemies. No one's considered ridiculous if you don't love the next door neighbor whom you've never talked to. We just call it normal. Well, it's this model. It's based on the 3 poisons. And here we look at the 3 poisons back in the middle scope in high school when we start to become our own therapist. But here we're now conquering the 3 poisons in relation to the objects of them in terms of the sentient beings, friend, enemy, stranger. So I also got this clear, and we're shifting from the illogic of ego. I love the friend because they make me happy. I don't love the enemy because they harm me and I couldn't care about the rest. We're shifting it from that because the logic is wrong. The logic ego uses is, I want you to be happy because you make me happy. We don't think we think this way, but this is the nature of the delusions, you know. So we're trying to shift it to this much more outrageous idea that Buddha's telling us to get to see in this equanimity meditation. Hang on a minute. Just a sec. So in this equanimity meditation, we use logic to argue with ego's misconceptions. We're becoming very clear that we're shifting our reason for wanting to love somebody and wanting them not to suffer. And the reason is not because they make me happy, but because they want to be happy. So we're trying to see this equanimity is that these three people are equal from one point of view. They each want to be happy, and they each don't want to suffer. So that sounds easy, but even then it's difficult, because when we hear it, then we hear some psychopath wants to be happy, and that sounds very nice. But then you think, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to pat him on the head? I don't know if we talked about this last week. That's not the conclusion at all, you know. The python wants to be happy. It doesn't mean you go, oh, the poor thing can't help it. Well, it'll eat you for breakfast if you're not sensible. Keep away from it. So keep away from the psychopath as well, please. But you've got to understand where they're coming from. And when you understand karma and delusions in the junior school and high school, you will understand why they are the way they are. And that is the basis of having compassion. So let's look again logically before we even go into these. I want to go and talk about the 8 verses, which is this classic transforming problems text. It's Tibetan text, 8 different verses, you know. But before that, let's look clearly at the meaning of the word suffering. We all know it so well, but when we look at the 4 Noble Truths, which we do in the middle scope in high school, the 4 Noble Truths, the 4 truths for the noble ones, it's Buddha's first teaching. The first one is that there is suffering, and there are 3 kinds, 3 levels. Now, this is where it's radically different. The first kind of suffering is simply called the suffering of suffering, which means, and that's the one we know. So forget even the bigger picture, which Buddha talks about, and he puts it in terms of all the realms of existence, the lower realms of the suffering of suffering. But forget that one. It's easier for us to understand it even in terms of this life. At least this is a good starting point for us. We know very well, and everybody in the universe knows, and even including the monkeys and the ants and the dogs, everybody knows what suffering is when you get what you don't want. Headache, knee ache, lousy weather, horrible food, mean boyfriend, you name it. It's very simple, you know. So we easily identify the suffering of suffering. But the trouble is that's all we think of as suffering. That's it. But this is just the first level for the Buddha, and it's the grossest level. It's a pretty intense one. And by practicing junior school, controlling our body and speech, we are stopping the causes of that one. Because the causes of why we have bad things happen to us in our life is because we've done those bad things in the past. So if you don't want that kind of suffering, first kind of suffering, go to junior school and abide by the laws of karma, and honey, you will not have future suffering. Fact. Because you just finished creating the causes. But there's a subtle level of suffering, and this is a second one. And that's more nuanced, and we don't like hearing this one. Because what this one is what we call happiness. Literally. So initially it's bizarre. No wonder we think, as Lama Zopa says, we've got to give up our happiness. Because what we think of as happiness is what Buddha says is a subtler, more pervasive, more shocking level of suffering. But it's like a honey-covered razor blade. And the only way to understand this is by understanding the causes of suffering. And this is even before we get to the subtlest level of suffering or pervasive suffering. So the only way to really comprehend these first 2, the suffering of suffering and the suffering of, the second one's called the suffering of change. And what we mean by happiness, Buddha refers to it as the suffering of change. In the simplest sense, and we know this, but we don't like to hear it, that what we do call happiness doesn't last. And that's puzzling to us because everybody in the universe knows the happiness from the chocolate cake doesn't last. We know it, but we don't want to think about it because we don't know any option. So we just think that's just the way it is. But we haven't looked at our minds deep enough. And this is the work in the middle scope. This is in the high school level of practice. This is where we become our own Buddhists, our own therapists, as Lama usually said. This is where we become a Buddhist. The first level of practice, controlling your body and speech, being a nice person, practicing ethics, that's common to anybody who's a good person. A good communist, a good Muslim, and a good Buddhist would all behave the same way. They won't harm sentient beings. So that's common, but not the second level. This is uniquely Buddhist trip. Getting into our mind and identifying the delusions that are the cause of this level of suffering. So the cause of this level of suffering is our friend attachment. This multifaceted, primordially deep, seemingly simple state of mind, but massively deep and primordial and really hard to see. So basically, a simple way of putting it, the suffering of suffering, which is the first kind of suffering, which is when the bad things happen. People harm you, kill you, lie to you, steal from you, sack you, whatever, or headaches and suffering. That suffering is actually, the way to put it, is it's when attachment doesn't get what it wants. You see, attachment, which runs the show, where this is what drives us, according to the Four Noble Truths, attachment is the main cause of day-to-day suffering. Ego grasping, root delusion, is the cause of being born in the first place. But this is the cause of perpetuating suffering in day-to-day life and then life after life. So we have to understand attachment, not what we think it is, not as in a cursory way, in a profound way. So first you know the definitions, and then you unpack and unravel your own mind. There's no shortcut. So attachment is, once we know this, all this is back in high school, but this is a preliminary, this is in order to get us to understand how we can have compassion properly. Without understanding this, we cannot have proper compassion. So that's why we can't leap over junior school and high school. So, hang on a tick. Got to blow my nose, excuse me. So, okay, so the first kind of suffering is when the bad things happen, is when attachment doesn't get what it wants. This junkie drives us all day, this primordially deep assumption that I must get only the nice things. That's attachment. So the millisecond it doesn't get what it wants, that's called aversion. And that's when the bad things happen. And that's what we mean by suffering. So now, the second kind of suffering, the suffering of change, which is what we mean by happiness, is getting what attachment wants, which is what drives all of us. The life of ordinary sentient beings, that's what Buddha calls samsara, is driven by trying to get what attachment wants, which is the nice things, and avoiding getting what attachment doesn't want, which is the ugly things. That's the definition of everybody's life, That's called samsara. It is utterly instinctive. We don't think it. Your mother doesn't teach you. We came into this life at the first second of conception, programmed from countless lives of this habit. So it's really hard to unpack it. And understanding this helps us understand transform problems as well. Absolutely. So then the cause of the suffering of change is attachment. And the cause of suffering is anger and the other variations that then cause us to do bad things with our body and speech that harm sentient beings. I mean, you can say like that. And so that means you have to understand attachment. Of course you do. So, okay. So why is it what we call happiness a level of suffering? And it seems a bit kind of cheap just to say, well, just because it doesn't last, like who cares? I'm happy to have another cake. I can wait and stop getting a diet, I can wait after feeling too fat after a piece of cake and have another piece of cake. But I mean, Buddha's this is the point that is sort of implicit here, but if we point it out, it's very powerful. When Buddha says it doesn't last, what he's telling us, but we have to wait to hear that, is that actually, hey, he's saying to us, hey guys, I've found a method of how to get happy that does last. Honestly, it's as simple as that. He doesn't say it like that, but you've got to kind of nut it out. All he's telling us is there is a level of happiness, there is a level of joy, and I mean, as Lama Yeshe talks about it in Mahamudra book, bliss, ecstasy, rapture. I mean, who would have thought those words? But this is the natural state. This is the point that Buddha's making. That's the natural state of our mind when it is unencumbered by delusions. So basically, what we as samsaric people think is that happiness, happy feelings, I'll explain what happiness is in a minute. Happiness, happy feelings are what we get When we get what attachment wants, that's it. That's samsara, you know. Get the cake, you get a happy feeling. Get the boy, you get a happy feeling. Get the new handbag, you get a happy feeling. Get a new job, you get a happy feeling. Have a good sleep, you get a happy feeling. We know that. This is true. And Buddha's not arguing. We do. But he says, you got it wrong, babies. Because attachment is so manipulative, so wicked, so cheating, that not only do you end up with happiness after that cake, you don't end up with happiness. We don't like to think about this. You do get it in the beginning. If you analyze the experience, you get the cake in the mouth and it's very delicious. That's a happy feeling. No problem. Buddha agrees. It's called a happy feeling. But the trouble is, what we don't see is that we are desperate and hungry and frantic for it to last. We know it won't, but that's why we're so devastated and disappointed when it doesn't last, because we have a deep assumption. Forget about ego grasping that believes it's all inherent, but look at grasping at things as permanent. This is one of our major delusions. Grasping at things as permanent. Grasping at things as existing forever. We frantically want it to exist forever. We know it doesn't, but we're constantly smashing into our own misconceptions, which is why we get devastated and disappointed when you feel fat and get acid reflux after your cake, or when your boyfriend leaves you. That's why do you think we're devastated? Disappointment and aversion are the result when attachment doesn't get what it wants. But the point is, attachment can't get what it wants because it's a lie. So not only, Buddha says, do you not get happiness from following attachment, not only do you not get happiness, all you've done is increase attachment. My mother used to say it. These profound things our mummies tell us. She'd say to me about food, and I think about it, I'd think and try to understand it. She'd say, the more you get, the more you want. Now, we know this. It's called addiction. Well, Buddha says, guess what, folks? You're all junkies. We're all addicts. It's just a question of degree and a question of the object. And I'm not joking. This is exactly Buddha's point. This is exactly Buddha's point. In our culture, it's only if you're a junkie for food or alcohol or 10 boys a day that you're called a junkie. The rest of us are normal. Buddha says, no, we're all mentally ill. We're all junkies. We're all addicts because we've got attachment. This is the point he's making. So, when we see the lie of attachment, and then we slowly the penny drops and we start to control our body and speech and our mind, and we become more content because we're giving up attachment, then we start to realize that, if we finish the path there at high school, you don't go onto the bodhisattva path, let's say, what you do, you then start to realize emptiness. And then you'd achieve your liberation. And then you would, in fact, have accomplished what Buddha is telling us is the accomplishment of liberation, of cessation of suffering and its causes. And how would you be? We're not used to thinking this way. How would you be if you have accomplished the cessation of suffering and its causes? How would you be? You can't conceive how you'd be. Your mind, forget bodhicitta. Your mind would be stunning. You'd be crystal clear. You'd have clairvoyance, you'd see the past, you'd see the future, you'd see the minds of others. You've got no longer any sense of a separate self. You've got no ego, you've got no attachment, no anger, no depression, no jealousy. You've only got virtue. You are only joyful. This is exactly and simply what Buddha's telling us is our potential. But it's so couched in all these concepts, we can't get into to hear it so simply, It's very fascinating. It's really fascinating. If we could hear it so brazenly, what Buddha's telling us, Liberation from suffering and its causes. This is our potential, right? So we've got to have conviction in that, and it takes time because we're all junkies, it's very hard. So if we understand all this, suffering is suffering, and now the suffering of change. So now what's the next one? The suffering, the third one's called all pervasive. It's the most primordial, the most subtle. So in terms of the realms of existence, which you might have thought about and studied, the beings and what they call, this is a Hindu, Buddha's coming from the Hindus, and they went all the way to the most subtle level of samsara, the peak of samsara. But Buddha diverged in his own direction because he said they haven't gone far enough. And the peak of samsara for them is the formless realm, the subtlest level of existence of a person whose mind is in the deepest, most subtle, most primordial absorption. They don't even have any other aggregates except the mind, Then you have slightly grosser ones called the form realm, who live living in this state of utter sort of subtlety and bliss. They're the ones who've got the all-pervasive suffering, only that one, because they haven't realized emptiness. Then the next lot, the gods Oh, they're the gods too, haven't got the, they've got, no, the gods and the humans, we've got the suffering of change. We get all the lovely things. So we've got the suffering, pervasive suffering, because we haven't realized emptiness, and we've got the suffering of change, because we haven't given up attachment. But we haven't got the lowest realm suffering. But the ones in the lowest realms, they've got the suffering of suffering, the lower realm suffering, they've got the suffering of change, and they've got the all pervasive suffering. So they've got the lot, you know. But in our own lives, we can see we've also all got it. We've all got it. So if you want to give up the suffering of suffering, you've got to stop harming sentient beings, abide by the laws of karma, live in ethics. Stop killing, stop stealing, stop lying. Then you at least get another decent human rebirth, and you would have quit the lower realms. Then, if you want to give up the suffering of change, you've got to give up attachment. And if you want to give up all of samsara altogether, you've got to realize emptiness. They're the antidotes to the 3 levels of suffering, you know. So all this is talked about in the Four Noble Truths. So understanding this for oneself on the wisdom wing is the basis now for you to get the hell out of suffering, because you're sick of it, because you understand that. But now you can afford to look at sentient beings and start to have proper compassion. Now you realize everybody is in the same boat. From the psychopaths to the saints, all locked into samsara. So it's only now you can begin to have proper compassion, because when you say compassion, what's compassion? That's empathy with someone suffering. So if you define suffering only as the first kind, when the bad things happen, which is the poor people and the sick people, which is the most evident kind of suffering, they're the only ones we have compassion for. So in other words, if a person's poor or their husband beats them, we have compassion for them. But if you see a person who's rich and the husband adores them, we think, what do you mean have compassion? Why should I have compassion for her? She's happy. That's our point. We're so addicted to that. And that's why in our own selves, we only look at the Dharma. We only start to meditate when we have the bad suffering. But we're all, you know, if I'm in love with whatever I said last week, whoever my boyfriend was, Burke. Where's Burke gone? I thought his name was Burke. Never mind. He's disappeared. I have to have Benjamin. So let's say Benjamin is my boyfriend. And I'm in love and everything's perfect, and someone says you should meditate, I'll say, what are you talking about? I'm happy. Because we're so addicted to the happiness of getting what attachment wants, we think there's nothing more. But we don't realize it's a honey-covered razor blade. It's going to change. You'll leave me, or you'll drop dead or something. Or I'll leave him. You're devastated. Because attachment can't last. It's not possible. We don't realize that. That's the point about that kind of suffering. So when we understand all this kind of different levels of suffering for ourselves and want to get the hell out of samsara, then this is the basis for having proper compassion for all sentient beings. Because when you say suffering, you mean the suffering of change for the happy people and the rich people. And then you mean the suffering for the poor people and the sick people. But also you mean even the subtlest ones, which you can't see on this planet, the peak of samsara, who haven't realized emptiness yet. So every single sentient being will be the object of your compassion. But you can't get this until you've gone through the stages of junior school and high school. The first and second scope. There's logic to it all. It's not just some gooey feeling, not some religious ideas, you know, there's logic to it all. So now we want to try and cultivate compassion for every sentient being. So we start with equanimity, but we now shift the logic of our reason to love somebody and have compassion, which is usually because I love Benjamin because he makes me happy and I have compassion for Benjamin. But if he leaves me for a younger version, my love and compassion are out the window. Now he's in my enemy category and I hope he suffers. Isn't it? We all understand that. So we're trying to get past that. We're trying to shift the reasoning. This is the basis of the compassion wing. And then you go through these stages, you know, to get to the culmination of which is bodhicitta. So basically, you're going through these stages of development in these 11 little stages of the two techniques. You put them together, and they culminate in bodhicitta, which is where this transforming problems business starts. You know, the major method, the major approach, is the one of all our Tibetan lamas. You know, is the one called exchanging self for others, and transforming problems is a component of that level of achieving bodhicitta. So let's go through these 8 verses then, this outrageous text. This approach, interestingly, comes from Atisha, and he got it from his teacher, Salingpa, I think, when he was in Indonesia for many years. It seems that Indonesia was a whole amazing, Vajrayana flourished in Indonesia, you know. And if we go to Borobudur and there's other places around there, you see these Vajrayana places. Huge at that time. And so Salingpa lived there. He traveled from India and he met his guru, Salingpa, in Indonesia and stayed many years there. And then he went back to India, I think, and then he went off to Tibet, Atisha, and then he died in Tibet. So he brought these teachings with him, you know. And these teachings of transforming problems, of exchanging self for others, of making this paradigm shift where you put others before self. These were kept secret. These teachings were kept secret because they're so opposite to the world, you know. So what are these teachings? So in these 8 verses, they're expressed really clearly, you know. And so we're trying to imagine, I mean, we've got to analyze it carefully, these 8 verses. I don't know if I put it in your course notes, did I? What course notes did I send you, Catherine? Do you remember?
Yes, I think we have it. Do you want me to share the screen?
What course notes did I send you? Do you remember? Is that what everybody got?
It's called Transforming Problems.
Oh, it was. Okay, some course notes. Was it in there? Did I put it in there? Do you remember? I don't think I did I? Is it in there?
I'll pull it up and see.
Okay, good. Fantastic.
Let's see.
Yeah. You'll see it in the contents. I can't remember. Not in the contents? No, okay, that's no problem. It's really simple. These 8 verses, let's keep it really simple. I'll go through them. It's okay. If you've got the text, that's good. If not, don't worry. But there's kind of like, they're kind of shocking on the face of it. But often what happens is when we read all these words and they're done in, they're sort of in nice poetic, you know, form, and we say them with a nice voice and it sounds like nice religious poetry. We don't penetrate the meaning. I mean, these verses, these verses, I mean, I joke and I say, especially the second verse, now you'll see what I'm saying. If a therapist advised what these verses are advising us to do, I mean, in our culture, you would happily sue that therapist. It's so outrageous. The advice is so ridiculous, so utterly opposite. And we did talk about this last week, you know. It's just opposite what we consider normal. So we've got to really, really think about it carefully to see the logic of it. So the whole point is this. We discussed this last week. I think Heather had a question. I went into detail. I use this analogy of, you know, in the world, you have a person like Lance Armstrong, this fanatic cyclist. No one called him weird if he stretched himself to his limit as he drove up those hills, exhausted with pain, exhausted. Nobody thought he was insane. Nobody criticized him because they knew he had this very profound goal of, you know, winning the Tour de France or whatever the medal might be. We appreciate this incredible, insane, over-the-top effort when it comes to achieving something like sport or whatever it might be. I mean, I remember, you know, when I first came to California in '94, and I remember reading in the Bay Area papers, I forget which Bay, and it might have been in the mid-90s, and it might even have been the Google guys when they first started. These IT guys who started in their garage. I think every IT person seems to start in his garage. I mean, maybe they build garages, especially for startups. I don't know. It's very funny. But anyway, these guys, I can't remember who they were, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was the Google guys. They talked about how they were getting ready for their IPO, for their initial public offering on the stock exchange, which is the goal of these startups, to get some funds. You know, it's like a miracle. It's like your goal has been achieved. So I remember one of them said, I forget the numbers, but it was something like, in order to be prepared for their IPO, they worked 7 days a week for 9 months, 20 hours a day or something. Now, people would say, you're mentally ill. I mean, the man's mad. But as soon as we know the reason why, it's this incredible goal, we admire that effort. Well, that's a bodhisattva. But what the effort they're making is to smash ego. That's the point. That's what will cause you to get bodhicitta. So the enemy for bodhisattvas is their own ego, because that's what's limiting them. They want to smash smash self-cherishing, smash attachment, smash ego grasping as quickly as possible. And this is what's hard to imagine, what motivates them, the goal for them. They're like fanatic. They're trying to get love and compassion for every sentient being. They can't bear the suffering of sentient beings. That's their goal and that's their motivation. Now, that's too abstract for us. We can't even imagine a person who is so fanatic. They'd rather have problems than happiness because they want to smash their ego. We think they're mad. That's like too fanatic for our mind. Well, that's what bodhisattvas are like. I mean, look at Lama Zopa. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't sleep. I mean, that's demented. He only practices day and night. We think, what the hell is he trying to prove here? We can't even comprehend it because our normal life is so normal. It's just too bizarre and shocking for us. We're doubtful about it. We think, what kind of person is that? What are you talking about? He never sleeps. As Roger, his attendant, said, for Rinpoche, sleep is a disgusting waste of time. We can't conceptualize that, you know. I remember even reading about some CEO who was fanatic and involved in his job. He slept 3 hours a night. I mean, that's pretty good. But to think, you know, and the reason that someone like Lama Zopa and these great yogis don't sleep is because, first of all, they've got complete control over their, because they're all Vajrayana practitioners, they're great yogis. They've got complete and effortless control over their body and their subtle energy. So they don't need sleep. But what drives them is their compassion. This is what's hard to hear. I know one time in Santa Fe, where I am now, and Lama Zopa was here, and I had to have a meeting about his book, his death book that I was editing. And he kind of just said to me, do you teach about bodhicitta? And I kind of blurted out. I said, Rinpoche, it's too intense. I just can't, you know. I mean, it's true. And I shout when I talk about these teachings because they're just so weird. They're so outrageous. I mean, I have confidence in them. I want to become like Lama Zopa and the Dalai Lama. That's my goal. But it's like too much to think. Never sleep. Only meditate day and night. I mean, I'm doing the biography at the moment. I was doing it 15 years ago, but now I'm back on it. For whatever reason, it stopped. Of Geshe Lama Kontrok, this amazing yogi. He's been to the States. He passed away in 2001. Who studied for years and years and years at Sarah J in the monastery, and then he escaped in 59, and he went straight to the mountains, and he disappeared for 15 years. He lived in his caves, no sleep, no food, no clothes, nothing. Because he's complete control over his body and mind, his subtle body and subtle mind, and he lived in bliss. Lama Zopa said he lived in Vajrayogini's Pure Land. So what motivates these people is compassion. They're not just doing it because they're blissful. They're not, the bliss doesn't motivate them. This is just a byproduct. It's compassion. This is hard to hear. It's hard to hear. That level of compassion. I mean, we can be incredibly compassionate. I mean, look at all the people now working in hospitals, for example, working for the people who've got the grossest suffering, the suffering of suffering. It must be exhausting. I mean, I'm hearing that people, doctors and workers are killing themselves from depression because we can't handle the pain. And that's just the gross level of suffering. We can see how it exhausts us. People who've got a difficult child and they spend their lives exhausted, drained, trying to have compassion, trying to help. I mean, it's beyond normal, because why, when we understand this without being negative about ourselves, is because we've got ego grasping, attachment, aversion, and all the rest. But we call that normal. We call that normal. So, and it is normal. But what Buddha's trying to get us to see is so radical, is that that's what's holding us back. So then to get this level of compassion, to want to rip out your ego as much as possible, which is exactly why you would want to transform problems. These yogis would rather have problems. They've accomplished this. So the best we can do is maybe once a year, try it, you know. I mean, it's too insane, but we got to understand the logic of it. It sounds to us, I mean, if we don't interpret this stuff properly, already we say, but I'm in a relationship. I'm in my relationship with Benjamin, but, you know, he's abusive and mean. And I sit there and I take it like a doormat and I'm a victim. And that's not what Buddha's talking about. As Pavanka Rinpoche says, you've got to be a suitable vessel for this kind of level of teachings. A suitable vessel is someone who's got renunciation, who understands karma, suffering, and its causes, and the delusions. So that's the inner work we have to do that then prepares us to comprehend even intellectually this level of practice, which is so outrageous, you know. So the very first verse in Transforming Problems, I mean, in this, yeah, it sounds weird, I have to explain it. Determined to obtain the greatest possible benefit from all sentient beings, not for. There's logic, there's real reasoning to this. I'll discuss it. Who are more precious. You've got to hear these words, okay? Because they sound so cute. But try and imagine the person writing this for whom this is real. It's impossible. This is the first verse, and each verse gets worse. Who are more precious to me than a wish-fulfilling jewel. Okay, forget wish-fulfilling jewels, okay? Just say $1 million, and then you'll get the idea. I will hold them most dear at all times. I mean, this is over the top in ordinary terms, okay? So why is it determined to obtain the greatest possible benefit from all sentient beings? This is how they talk, and it's important to understand this. So Catherine's a doctor, right? Aren't you? You're an MD or something? Okay. So
yes.
Okay. So an MD is a person who wants to help sick people, right? So if Catherine just sat in her little house and put a little sign up, MD, and I'm open, from 2 to 4 a day in the richest suburb possible where everybody's got, people don't need a doctor, and she says, oh, I'm a doctor, you'll know she's lying. So Catherine, wants, what does Catherine need? This is the point now. What does she rely upon? What does she need in order to be a good doctor? She needs sick people. So she doesn't want sick people to be sick, but if she can't get sick people to come to her rooms, then she can't be a doctor. She'll just sit there twiddling her thumbs and dispensing Band-Aids possibly. She'll never learn to be a proper doctor. So putting it here, determined to obtain the greatest possible benefit from all these sick people. I will hold every one of them as so dear and precious. That then she'll be powerfully motivated to want to help sick people. That's the meaning. She doesn't want there to be sick people, but she needs there to be sick people. As one Geshe Sopa said, enemy. He said the best one for the bodhisattvas, they need their enemies. So Catherine needs sick people. The more sick, the better. The more sick, the better. And this is the point now, listen, the more sick, the better. Why? Because that pushes her skills to the limit. And the quickest way she'll become the best doctor is having the worst sick patients. In fact, you should give up work, Catherine, and go to Doctors Sans Frontières and go to where there are war zones with people with missing legs and noses. That'd be the quickest way to become the best doctor. Do we get the point? That's what a bodhisattva wants. So they don't want to sit up in the boring old trees and looking all blissful at the sky. They do that to get their realizations, and then they come down to the junky cities where the maniacs live and all the wackos and the psychopaths. Bodhisattvas want the psychopaths, I promise. That's the analogy. So they need suffering sentient beings. And then it says, who are more precious than $1 million? I mean, excuse me, you got to think, what the hell are they talking about? What do you mean? So again, Catherine, if she's so motivated by compassion to benefit sentient beings, then her patients are the most precious for her. And you should hear this point though, not just, oh, the poor patients, oh, the poor patients. No, they're grist for her mill. She is trying to become the best doctor in the universe. She's trying to become a Buddha. So she wants the worst patients for this reason, so that more quickly she'll become the best doctor. That's what they're not just trying to be nice. Oh, I feel sorry for my patients, no, because they're the grist for her mill. They're the way to help her become the best doctor in the planet as quickly as possible. So the bodhisattvas want the worst scenarios possible. They want the craziest sentient beings who are so precious, because without those sentient beings and their suffering, you cannot rip out ego. So the only way to rip out ego is to get something that confronts ego. The only way for Lance Armstrong to win the Tour de France is to have the toughest mountains and ride at the limit of his strength. It's like that. So it's intense. I'll hold them most dear at all times. And who is he holding most dear? Not just your beloved, not just your poodle, not just your boyfriend. Every damn sentient being, all the creeps, all the Mr. Trumps, all the psychopaths, all the rapists, all the terrorists. Every one of them. And you'll never even comprehend that until you understand karma and delusions in junior school and high school. This is the evolution of these stages of practice. That's the first verse. That's bad enough. Now, next one is where you'd sue your therapist for giving you this advice. I promise. When in the company of others, which is every day, we're very social people, I will always consider myself the lowest of all. Before we even go further, this is shocking. I mean, like I said, your therapist tells you to do this, you'd sue them. Hang on. It's too shocking. I mean, and this is where Pabonka says, to hear this properly, you've got to be a suitable vessel. So this kind of practice, if you're like a Lance Armstrong, if you can't take those tough mountains, no one would praise you for trying. You'll kill yourself. So the same with this level of practice. This is why it is so important to understand that these teachings are progressive. And if you can't cope with that level because you're not a suitable vessel, because you're still living in a relationship with Benjamin where he abuses you daily, and you're sitting there like a little victim, full of rage and despair, but terrified to move and terrified to say anything, and you've got no self-esteem and you have no understanding of your own mind and have no understanding of what's going on, this is not for you. But if we hear it like that, then, oh, I'm supposed to let Benjamin beat me up every day. I'm already, but what we would say is, well, excuse me, mate, I'm already feeling like the lowest of all. What do you want me to do? Grovel? We can't hear it properly if we haven't done some work. And the fact is, you've got to be wise. If you're at work, you've got to know if you're capable of this level of practice. Or you might try it sometimes. But it's very shocking for us to think this. If someone at work abuses you and you think I should always consider myself the lowest of all, and from the depths of my heart, hold them as dear and supreme. Again, the same logic. The whole logic that drives these verses is the wish to smash the obstacle to your becoming a Buddha, which is your ego grasping and your self-cherishing. There must be allergies here in Santa Fe. So there's two things here. It's very interesting. In the first stages of practice, in the junior school and high school, as I call it, in the middle scope and lower scope, first stages of the Lam Rim, the wisdom wing, the main problem, as we're talking, is attachment. There's no question, attachment. This is the main voice of ego. But here, it's framed differently, and it's logical. Because in the first stages of practice, we're trying to give up the enemy that's causing me suffering, which is attachment and aversion, and then the actions I do with my body and speech that keep sowing more negative seeds that cause me future suffering. I'm trying to quit that. So attachment's the enemy. Attachment is the enemy. But here, you continue to work on your mind in the compassion wing, but the emphasis shifts. In the first level, it's to back away, leave sentient beings alone, mind your own business and don't harm them, and control your body, speech, and mind. Here, having done some work, having harnessed the energy of your body, speech, and mind to some degree, we are now continuing to work on our mind, but it's now in reference to breaking down the barriers between self and other. So in that framework, and all the way to bodhicitta, the enemy is now called, as we call it, selfishness, putting self first. So when you've got attachment, that's what you do, but it's termed attachment. Here, it's called self-cherishing. The Tibetans have the nice phrase, self-cherishing. They mean selfishness. We call it selfishness. They call it self-cherishing. I remember a person came to a course first that I gave in Vermont at Milarepa Center. They'd never been before, and it was about self-cherishing. And she said she came. She said, I was so excited to learn how to cherish myself. I was so happy. She got quite a shock when she discovered what self-cherishing was. Anyway, so the whole aim here is to rip out, that's what bodhicitta is this paradigm shift where now others naturally and spontaneously and continuously are more important than you. But these words are dangerous in our culture. We just can't comprehend it, And that's why you've got to be a suitable vessel. You've got to have done the first work first, the wisdom wing, to properly understand it. Otherwise, we'll misuse these tools, just to feed ego. So when in the company of others, I'll always see myself as the lowest of all and see everybody else as supreme. So, I mean, for me, the best way to try and think of practicing this and make it real, this is too general, it's too outrageous, it's too broad all the time. I mean, you can't even know what to think. But think of it like this. You're at work, you're at home, people, in your circle. There are some you don't like. It's the way life is. We've got aversion for them. Well, that person in particular, and don't just say it to them, but check your mind and observe that person and then think of something they can do that's better than you. Like maybe they've got cuter ears. I'm not joking. Maybe their hair's prettier. Maybe they're thinner and you want to be thin. Maybe they're more sharp. Maybe they've got a prettier voice. Maybe they're more intelligent, but something that's better than you directly and specifically. That's how you practice this. One tiny person at a time. It's profound for the mind, So, to say I see myself as the lowest of all is too dramatic for us. We don't even know what it looks like. What am I supposed to do? Kind of grovel? We can't even imagine it, So do that. That's what it means. See someone, especially if you don't like them, and find one thing about them that's better than you. It's very powerful. That's what practice, and that means they are higher and you're lower. But we don't like those phrases. In our psychology, in our world, that's very scary to talk this way. So we'd use whatever words you prefer. It's like delighting that they're more intelligent than you. Put it that way. Whatever works for your mind, but get the point. Because you're trying to smash the instinct of ego grasping, which gives rise to self-cherishing, to put you first and to put you up, Hard to hear this stuff. So blunt. These words are so blunt, The third verse is mostly about your mind. It's interesting. Vigilant. The moment a delusion appears in my mind. This is already outrageous, and I'll explain. Endangering myself and others, a delusion, get a bit of anger. Oh my God, I'm endangering others. Who thinks that? Nobody. I will confront and avert it without delay. That's the real practitioners. That's being your own therapist, because you're so involved. You're so clear about your own mind. You see your mind every second. You're so cautious. You can't bear the thought of having even a moment of delusion. So the implication here, would you not think, is it says the moment a delusion arises in my mind. I mean, the assumption is that the default is virtue. I mean, for us, delusions are the default. So this already, we can see Mr. Lungri Tangpa, the author, clearly was already a bodhisattva. So the moment you see a little moment of delusion, a little moment of anger, a little moment of attachment, you grab it and you get rid of it immediately. That's advanced. That's exactly what the practice is. Now, these next three, they each get, the way I think about it, the first one is like for the world in general out there. Then it gets closer to home and it's all your people. And then the sort of in general, like work and around your family. And then the third one is like in relation to your beloveds. You listen. So now, these words, remember these written in like the 10th century or something, a bit more than that. No, he was here. Like, for example, he was a teacher's disciple, so it's like 10th, 11th, 12th century or something. Whenever, hear these words, whenever I see people who are evil in nature, I think we'd say psychopaths. That's a common word we use these days, isn't it? For the wackos, you know, for the seriously mentally ill people, for the serious harmers. Whenever I see people who are the psychopaths. Now think of this in 10th century Tibet, 12th century Tibet. I'm sorry. You might have heard about one 500 miles away, you know. Occasionally. I mean, I think if you sort of transported yourself from 12th century Tibet to the 21st century, you know, even Denver, mild old Denver or mild old Santa Fe, they have a mental breakdown. The shockingness of the delusions, the shockingness of the intensity of the suffering would be hard to imagine. And this is back then. So we're seeing and hearing about them and meeting them all day. We're bombarded by the most intensely kind of suffering people. Our politicians, I mean, it's like the world is insane. So we're in the midst of hearing about and seeing crazy people, demented, really seriously suffering human beings, no question, driven by delusions, you know. So as it says, when I see the psychopaths, when I think about the psychopaths, when I read about the psychopaths, you know, whatever, because we're bombarded all day, and who are overwhelmed, this is what the point, who are overwhelmed by violent, negative actions and suffering. That's exactly the point. And listen to the way he's talking. It's a compassion-based, not anger. That's the point here. I will hold such rare ones dear. So first of all, they're not rare. They're a dime a dozen now. Maniacs. The world is so suffering. As if I had found a precious treasure. So again, we have to understand the logic here. It's very simple. It's like Catherine saying some suffering, demented person is completely out of his mind on drugs and every other thing with half a leg and, you know, bits and pieces missing, and he's a maniac as well as suffering. She'd have to have compassion. This person is overwhelmed by delusions and suffering. It's very simple. But especially if they're harming other people, that's where it's so difficult. We discussed this last week, I think. In our world, there's not a millimeter of space to see harmers as in any way human whatsoever, you know. And I see that in the prison system. I mean, there's so much anger that I think anger drives it. Anger, and I don't know, I mean, especially in this country, maybe it's the same everywhere over the world. But it's vindictive. If you're naughty, you've got to suffer. There's a man I know in New York prison. He's the longest serving prisoner in New York, 58, 59 years. He's nearly close to death now, 80 something. He killed a girl when he was 20 something. And there's this, since he's tried for his parole, he's studied, he's a Buddhist, he's devoted, he's got university degrees, he's got a doctorate, he helped people in prison, he's had no write-ups for 58 years in prison, being like a saint. And they will never give him parole because there's always these, you know, this vindictive around that neighborhood, one of the small cities in New York, in upstate New York, determined that he has to be in prison, determined, look what he did when he was 20. He deserves to suffer. That's the attitude, you know. So you know yourself, you've done one thing wrong and someone never forgives you. They define you by that. You know how that is unbearable. So this is the whole point here. The more we learn to know our own mind, and this is a really important point, this one. I think we discussed this last week as well. Let's say we see a psychopath, you know, which is a term we use for a very suffering person. Lots of attachment, lots of anger, lots of, you know, heavy negative karma. So it's very hard for us to see why I should have compassion for that person. And we will never understand that. And I don't know if we discussed it last week, until I understand my own mind. So like I said last week, I try to use, when I read all my newspapers and my New York Times, all my different papers on my iPad, I read lots of them. And I read about these crazy people and the crazy politicians all over the world, whatever. So instead of this, how dare they, look at this evil person, oh my God, look at these evil people, which we love to do, to criticize. It's like a workshop. It's like Catherine, when she looks at all the cancerous bodies, she doesn't go, oh, this is disgusting, go away. She can't wait to get her microscope on the disgusting cancer so she can analyze it, so she can fix it. That's how we should be with the suffering world. You should see all these people and their crazy minds, and you should see it as like a workshop. You're so excited to me. I'm so happy to read about Mr. Trump, you know. I mean, the Washington Post apparently has counted every single lie he's told in the last 4 years, right? 490,000 lies, whatever it is, okay? But, you know, so I go, when I read Mr. Trump, I go, well, look, he lies. He supposedly lies. He's angry. He grabs ladies by the you-know-what. He does this, he does that, he's this, whatever you think he does, if you don't like him. People who love him think he's a saint. So then instead of criticizing, I see it and I go, well, I recognize lying. I recognize stealing. I recognize killing. I recognize attachment. I recognize anger. I recognize arrogance. Thank you, Mr. Trump, for showing me how not to be. That's a powerful way to practice. Instead of criticism, you see it and you're like, oh my God, or you see things, you go, oh, look at the karma of that. That's how you learn about karma and suffering. You interpret the world through the lenses of karma and delusions, so you can learn about it. Not go, oh, how evil that is, you know. It's very powerful. Then and the other point is this. If I look into my life and I see that I definitely have harmed some people, and I look at why have I harmed people, it's because of anger. It's because of depression. It's because of jealousy. It's because of resentment. It's because of feeling hurt. So that's why I harm people. I don't harm people because of love, compassion, forgiveness, kindness. Of course I don't. So if I can harm people in the little bit based on my anger and my jealousy, then can you imagine the pedophile or the psychopath 20,000 times more? Then you will have compassion, because the first level of practice is compassion for yourself. That you know why you suffer and you don't beat yourself up with guilt. You go, oh my God, you know, I am sick of this. I don't want this suffering anymore. So it's like a kindness to yourself. And once you got it for yourself, it is easy to have compassion for the pedophile, because you realize, can you imagine their mind? Look at your own demented mind when you can't say no to the cake. Can you imagine when you keep stuffing the cake in the mouth and you go, oh, I've got to go on a diet. I'm so much attached to food. I can't cope with it. Or you get jealous easily. Your poor crazy mind goes mad. Can you imagine the mind of a pedophile? But we just want to be angry with him because we don't understand why he's like it. Well, because of attachment. Guess what? Brought it with him from past life. Obsession with sex. And happens to be with little girls or something. So can you imagine his tormented mind? I mean, one of my friends on death row in Kentucky, I did a Facebook page today. I remember I had a conversation with my friend Mitchell, who's been a Buddhist since the 90s. I've known him since the 90s. And he's getting close to his death date. He's an amazing man. Anyway, he told me I'll tell you about him in a minute. I had a phone conversation with him. But he's this guy I know who comes to the teachings, and he's very low key and relaxed. And Mitch said to me years ago, he said, Robina, he thinks of torture all the time. So can you imagine we just think of cake all the time. If you're into sex, you think of sex all the time. And we know it makes us crazy. We know we can't stand it, but we can't stop. Why? Because of habit, because of karma and habit. That's it. So if you can have compassion for yourself, for your pathetic habits and not eating too much cake, can you only imagine the tormented mind of a person like this guy who wants to torture people all the time? He doesn't know why. His mother didn't teach him. He brought this habit with him. This is where at least factoring karma in is at least some basis for understanding why a person's like this. His mother didn't teach him, you know. We don't understand this in the West at all. We have no answers to this, you know. So can you imagine his tormented mind? And you never can stop thinking about these dreadful things. Or you're some guy who wants to thinking of having sex with little girls all the time. But we don't want to have compassion. We would rather be angry, because that's the model we have in our culture. We have to blame somebody, you know. So that's why you'll never get compassion until you give that one up. And that's the work we have to do on the first scope, you know. So anyway, Mitchell, I spoke to him this morning. And he's like, he's 50 something. He's a grandfather, and he was in a shootout when he was selling drugs. He's a white boy, southern white boy, with his friend Leaf, who's a Catholic. And they were both in this shootout, and some people died. We've got guns and drugs. What do you think? People are going to die, you know? I mean, they're not psychopaths. They're just into drugs, you know? So they're on death row, and it's like 30 plus years. And Mitchell's done all his appeals, and he's getting close to death. But he understands it. He laughs, he's joked. He's such an amazing man. He gets up at 4 every morning, does all his practices. He told me all his practices this morning. He does his prostrations, he does the 7 limbs, he does this, he writes that, he does Mahamudra, then he does this, and he does Shakyamuni Buddha, then he does Tara, then he does 2 hours non-stop practice, 4 o'clock in the morning. Loves his practice, loves it. Totally enjoys his practice. His breakfast tray comes at 5 o'clock. He gives it to the other guys. And then he goes and does arts and crafts all day, and he writes to these different people. And then he reads. He's studying and reading, you know. He's studying and reading. And he's ready for death. I mean, it's a joke. I mean, he told me recently, one of his friends, who's a fanatic of health, he died of a heart attack on death row, you know. Another one of our friends on death row years ago, he got leukemia and he died instead. So, you know, even when you think death row, you know, death can grab you anytime. So he's ready for his death. And I mentioned it also on the Facebook page. Let's put it on the Facebook this evening. Somebody put it for me. That, you know, the last time I saw him last year, we had a meeting in the chapel. And he was trying to work out how to think when they're going to put because he was sentenced in the 80s, and the law then was he has to be electrocuted, even though it's no longer acceptable. He's still got to be electrocuted because that's the law, right? So the person's got to come up to him, a guard, and this close to him, and put all the wires on his body, and put wet sponges up here, and put a cloth on his head, and they sit him in the chair, then they electrify him. You know, they burn him up. So he said, should he be thinking of compassion and looking at the guard, or should he be internal and thinking about his guru? So he decided it's best to let the guy do his job, you know, don't interfere, and just be internal, and then just be ready when they turn the switch and fry him, you know. And he jokes about it. So he's ready for death. We all should be. Same thing. Anyway, why am I talking about that? Transforming problems. I mean, the perfect example, he's living in these shitholes, this dump of a prison, boiling hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter, you know, in this section where there's all the death row guys in their red jumpsuits. A bunch of them are psychopaths, for sure. Some of them are good human beings. He does his life. He's completely content, doesn't complain. He's transformed problems. It's very simple. Very content, you know. Very amazing. I have such admiration for him. I think it's time for questions. 1 whole hour I've been raving on. We're up to the 3 heavy verses. We'll get there in a minute. So come on, questions, please. Any old questions you like.
What were the verses from?
It's called the 8 verses of mind training, usually, and it's by a person called Lungri Tangpa. You look online, you'll find dozens of versions of it. It's really well known. The 8 verses of mind training, they usually call it. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, good.
Andrew posted them a link from lamayeshe.com of the 8 verses in the chat box that you can click on.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Robina. Thank you for that analogy. It's very helpful.
Good. It makes sense. Otherwise, we can't hear it properly. You know, it's very interesting. Okay. Okay. Huh? Yeah, please.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, I'll go for
it. I keep thinking, you know, you said if you're not at the level, then you made the analogy with the Tour de France, and if you're not ready for the mountains, they'll kill you. And this, I'm wondering, should I be trying to practice these advanced compassion practices, or should I just stick to trying to really work on my renunciation?
I understand. But let me ask you this thing then. When you hear these teachings, can you even understand intellectually the logic of them?
Yeah, intellectually, okay. I think I can get it.
Stop, then you're ready. Because a person who wouldn't be ready is a person who, when they hear these verses, they are so shocked, because that person is still only in the victim mode. And we're all victims. If we've got attachment and anger and jealousy and afraid to leave our husband because he beats us, and hating our boss and blaming everybody else and thinking I'm a victim and taking no responsibility, that's the person who's not ready. So if you're responding, that's outrageous advice, and you storm off and you turn your Zoom off and you're going to sue me for speaking such nonsense, then you're not ready. But if you understand even intellectually, then you're ready, baby, to try it. Now, the point is, if you were sent to prison tomorrow and wrongly accused of murdering somebody, you'd have no choice. You'd jump at the deep end. And that's what often my friends in prison, a good example, they're not ready for it, but they have either they go mad or they transform their dumpy situations, so be brave and try it. Because I mean, if you can go on for enunciation till eons, you'll never get anywhere. You won't get so far. But if you understand it, even intellectually, you do your best to try it. You understand it and you understand what you're doing, and then you've done some enunciation, then you're able to try it. There's no question. Or even aspire, to be like this. And try it. I mean, some person just runs in, something simple, like if you're, no longer at airports, but you're in a shop and someone barges in front of you. Keep it simple. Don't wait for someone to want to murder you. Don't wait to be wrongly accused of murder. Do you see my point? Don't wait for the worst situation. Baby ones, tiny ones.
So it's okay to take on bite size.
Yes, of course, you've got to start small. If you want to start big, like jumping in the deep end, then okay, but don't wait for that to happen. Don't wait to get cancer. Don't wait for your wife to leave you. Don't wait for the terrible things to happen. That's often what we do. We rest on our laurels. Oh, my life's so fortunate. No, practice the tiny. You've got to practice small. You get Catherine to start trying to be a doctor and do surgery after the first day of learning medicine. No, the best she can do is dispense an eye. She can dispense a Band-Aid, maybe. So you've got to go small. Then you grow. It's all like that. It's incremental, but catch your mind, watch it. Do you understand?
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Who else?
Veneral, I have a quick question.
I'm so sorry. Are we 90 minutes or 2 hours, Catherine? I forget.
We could do whichever you like.
We'll see how we go.
2 hours, but 90 minutes is fine too.
Okay, darling. Of course. Go on, honey. Go, darling.
Yeah, so is there a way to affect or purify another person's karma?
No, not directly. We all affect each other because that's what interdependence means. Mm-hmm. Every time you help a person, you affect them. But, you can bring a horse to water and you can't make it drink. So you can help a person even with a Band-Aid, but if they don't want your Band-Aid, you can't help them. So a person has to be a willing victim to your help, or a person has to be, so we affect each other because we're open to each other. And so in that way, that's how we can help people with wisdom. But you can't purify my mind. That's like saying when you, Dana, play piano, that Robina will get to play piano. No, I've got to play piano, but you can help me learn to play piano. But I've got to do the piano myself. So you can't change my mind. My mind is my thoughts, my tendencies. I can learn from you. I can be affected by you. That is the fact. But I've got to do the work. It's very clear.
So when we look at these verses, the Bodhisattva is really using these other sentient beings for their own growth, right? And
good way to put it. That's exactly. So in other words, and this is odd to think about it like this. When we think of a doctor helping people who are sick, we think the reason there is to help the sick person. It's true, but you've got to, but it seems selfish for us to think Catherine's wanting to become the best doctor. That's like she's just doing it for her own selfish reasons. It sounds weird, but the point is that what drives that is compassion, because Catherine wants to become the best doctor as quickly as possible so she can help millions more people. And the best way to do that is have the worst patients. That's what the Bodhisattva, so it is to help the Bodhisattva achieve that so they can help more people, not just rest on their laurels and get the highest pay. And that's what's hard for us to hear. It sounds weird to us. Do you understand?
Yeah. I think what's helpful is to understand that it's not necessarily helping that particular sentient being, but to
well, I mean, it would be, wouldn't it? Of course it would be. No, that's nihilistic.
No,
that's not possible. Just because you helping a sentient being, it depends on the level of help. You can meet a person who doesn't want your help, but you could give them one Band-Aid and they might be able to use the Band-Aid. So you, with your wish and your wisdom and your compassion, want to help them, and they will accept a little bit of your help. You've done something. I mean, you don't just go around having compassion and nobody gets helped. That's bizarre. It couldn't be that way.
Okay.
You see my point? It's more nuanced than what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
But the energy behind it is a weird one for us. We've got to really think of it carefully. And we can't conceive of this level of compassion. And that's why people in Catherine's job are getting burned out, exhausted, drained. We don't know why. We just think it's normal to get drained and exhausted if you meet suffering people all day. No, that's not the reason. A bodhisattva who has given up attachment and given up anger and given up jealousy and given up ego grasping would never get tired of helping people. And that's the point. They would get more inspired and more powerful and more compassionate and more capable. They would never get tired. They would never give up. That's what a bodhisattva is, which is hard to imagine. And the reason we get burned out is because of our own attachment. Attachment, you see, attachment is this junkie in us. And it sounds very cruel. Attachment is this frantic junkie in us running every decision we make alongside our virtue. Our virtue is our saving grace. This tempers the attachment, but attachment is there until we're hardly realized. And attachment is a junkie in us that only wants the nice things. So the more, say some of Catherine's maybe colleagues, and I'm not being horrible here, we've got to understand this, who are ordinary people, who are good nurses, good doctors, but they're quite self-centered. They will get exhausted. They won't know how to cope with all this suffering because their attachment isn't getting what it wants. Your attachment is being smashed in the face by seeing all these suffering, crazy people. You can't cope with it. But it's only when you've given up attachment and given up anger that you only then have wisdom and compassion. And so your ability to bear suffering is unbelievable. And you'll increase your compassion every second because you actually see the suffering of the human beings. The suffering is unbearable. Like Lama Zopa says, you have this unbearable compassion. Well, it's hard to imagine it. But the more we understand attachment and aversion and the delusions and how to get rid of them, the more we can understand this level of compassion and therefore the limitless enthusiasm of these great bodhisattvas, you know. You understand what I'm just saying? Just blah, blah here. What else, people? Some questions?
I have a question.
Like Benjamin said, we've got to go one step at a time. You can't leap into being Catherine can't leap into suddenly being a surgeon if she's all she can do is band-aids. You've got to know what you're doing, but you aspire to go further, driven by your compassion. That's the point. Yeah. Who else?
Yeah, it's not difficult for me to look at the president and see that he's a psychopath and see that he's suffering and see, that he deserves compassion because it can't possibly be pleasant to be inside his head. And it's not hard for me to think, Mitch McConnell loves his dog. You don't exaggerate him into all one thing or the other. But then I get stuck on so what? I mean, so what? What happens then?
What's the action?
It seems, what's the action? I mean, what does that have to do with
That's exactly the right question. If Catherine sees the suffering of sickness, she realizes at this certain point she's got this particular patient, but she suddenly realizes she hasn't got that skill. She'd be devastated, wouldn't she? Because she can't help. So she would have this enormous enthusiasm. I must keep learning more medicine so I can help more people. That's a bodhisattva. So that's the solution. You see a suffering person, the whole goddamn point is to have compassion. So you think, I must continue to become a Buddha so I can benefit them. That's the whole point.
So am I supposed to benefit Donald Trump individually?
Every damn being in the universe, Heather.
Yeah.
Every single one, every worm, every hell being, every spirit, every god, every human, every mega rich person, every psychopath, every single one. Then the more you see your mind in the junior school and high school, the more you'll see their mind and the more you will know the suffering they've got now. But crucially, honey, you'll see the suffering that they're causing themselves for the future. That's karma. Not just now being in Mr. Trump's head. If he is a psychopath, if he is, then look at the karma he's going to be experiencing for the future. That's the real basis of real compassion, the lower realm suffering of these beings for countless eons, for the harm they're doing now. That's the real basis of real compassion. And that's the basis of compassion for yourself. In the earlier scope, if you kill and steal and lie, you don't want the future suffering of being killed or stolen or lied to, and not to mention lower realms. That's when you get compassion for yourself, which is renunciation. Then you change it to others. It's the future suffering that's the worst part, not just now, nothing now. Do you understand?
Yeah, I'm just not a bodhisattva. So
Darling, join the universe.
at this point in my where I'm at, what is the
Heather.
action? Or is it just in your mind?
Heather, I'm going to butt in. You're on a path, right? You're on this path.
Yes.
Have humility and patience. You
I'm
don't just go, oh, I'm not a doctor now. I can't do this. I'm leaving. No, you aspire, petal. What do you think a bloody Buddha is? Some cute little dude with a nice little Vajrayogini or something cute? No, they're people who put their hands in the shit and help suffering people. You got to aspire for it, baby. Excuse me.
I agree, and I do. I think I do, but I'm sitting in Santa Fe in a pandemic. What am I supposed to do about Donald Trump being a psychopath?
Heather, you need to study the Dharma more. May I suggest that? If you ask that question, you haven't got a clue what you're talking about. Forgive me. You better study the Dharma.
That's why I'm asking.
Well, then you study the Dharma. You've got all the Lam Rim. I'll send you a couple of books and you can study them. I just
Fair
told you the answer. You study the Lam Rim first. You study junior school and high school and live in your vows and stop killing and stop stealing and stop lying because you don't want future suffering. And then you start to look at your mind and see your shitty attachment and aversion and delusions and see how that's putting you in your muck, and you get incredible renunciation and you want to keep moving. And on the basis of suffering, of compassion for yourself, you now have compassion for others. You've got to go one step at a time. To junior school, high school, university, postgraduate. That's why I keep repeating that the whole time. That's what you have to do. Keep studying, keep practicing, and slowly the pennies will drop. You can't help Donald Trump now. You can't help 99% of the universe right now, but you can motivate, you can keep studying so you'll become a Buddha, so you can help others. That's what a Buddha is. You understand? But every time you read about Mr. Trump and the others, you use it as a grist for your mill to see suffering and to see how it's causing him suffering, which increases your wish to work on yourself and do your practices and become a Buddha. That's the way you use the world. You can't help him now. If you can walk up to Mr. Trump tomorrow and change him, please go and do it. But you use him as an example. Catherine can't go and help every single person who's sick, but every time she reads about it, it can inspire her to keep being a better doctor so she can help people when they come to her. That's the attitude. You're using it all as grist for your mill to show you the nightmare of samsara and what samsara is and how it causes, how all sentient beings are locked in this samsara. I mean, these words, it takes time for us to see all this. You know, you understand, sweetheart?
Yes.
Good. Good. Thank you. Who else? Who else, people? Nobody else? No more questions? We'll keep going with the verses then. We'll go to the worst ones. I mean, they're perfect questions, Heather. They're totally perfect questions. Okay. So the first one, for me, the first one is a little bit like when you read the papers and see the world and hear about the psychopaths. That's pretty intense. Now it's getting, and okay, so why, again, I will hold such rare, I mean, Heather's questions are perfect. I will hold such rare ones. We can't say rare in these days, they're common, dear again, as if I'd found a precious treasure. In other words, again, when you see someone who's so suffering, you realize the suffering of samsara, and then you're so happy to see it because by seeing it and forcing you to have compassion for that person, and this is the point, Heather, not just because Mr. Trump is suffering now, let's assume he is a psychopath. I'm not saying he is. I am not saying he is. I do not know the man. We do not know who anybody is, they say in the Bodhisattva path, so don't judge. So let's just use anybody. It doesn't matter who we're talking about. If there is a person, like my friend on death row who thinks of torture all the time, we know that he does that, so his mind is suffering. So that when I hear about that, why do I think of him as a precious treasure? Because it's showing me the depth of the suffering of samsara. And the only reason I'm trying to see this is because it's such a shocking example. It causes me to think I have to never give up working on myself, becoming a Buddha, so then I will be capable of helping countless sentient beings. So you're using it as grist for your mill. That's the point. The next one, my feeling is this is getting closer to home now. This is like at work or among your broader family. When out of envy, others mistreat me with abuse, insults, and the like. Well, everybody has that. Look at your auntie, your brother, person at work, your colleagues, this is the suffering of most people, being harmed and hurt by others. abused, maybe they're envious of you. And especially at work, this is really common at work among colleagues, Someone's jealous and they end up criticizing you and you lose your job or something. So when out of envy, others mistreat me with abuse and harm and all the rest, I'll accept the defeat and offer the victory to them. See, this is where you've got to be so wise, If I'm in this relationship with Benjamin and I'm the victim and he beats me every day and I keep saying, yes, darling, you're right and I'm wrong, this practice is not for me. I've got to stand up and say, I'm out of here, Benjamin, goodbye. That's my practice. So you've got to know where you're at. And so, of course, on Benjamin's point, you do bite size. You've got to know where you're at. So this is profound practice, but absolutely against the grain, 100% against the grain. We can't imagine that as intelligent. We just can't imagine it, I always tell this story. It's a lovely story, such a nice story, about a Buddhist guy in Sydney years ago, and he was having a party. All his Buddhist friends were there. Some of my friends were at the party. And he was telling him about how his brand new BMW, he discovered had a scratch right along the door. And he thought, oh, well, I'll buy a new door. So he fixed his car. It happened again. It happened like a third time. And he discovered it was this wacko old guy next door. He had no idea why this old guy was scratching his car. But obviously this old guy thought this fellow had done something wrong. I don't know what his name is, John or something. So John told this story. He said to his friends, all my friends there, what should I do? Well, somebody said, well, you should sue him. Somebody said, scratch his door. And then someone said, my friend George said, well, I'll tell you what Lama Zopa would do. He would discover what this old guy liked. He would buy him a beautiful gift. And he would go and apologize sincerely for whatever he'd done wrong. Now, this is opposite to normal, isn't it? I remember reading in the papers. I read so many newspapers and magazines. I remember in Vanity Fair, there's this long story about these two billionaires who live in Connecticut somewhere, or one of those places where they're by the beach and they're, $10 billion houses. 10 years ago, some argument started over the trash can, on the wrong side. And now it's come into, they kind of $20 million court cases and suing each other and having armies just about. And that's how things go, isn't it, when something goes wrong? But John thought this is a great idea. Oh, he said, what a good idea. So he discovered this old fellow liked golf. He bought him these very expensive golf balls, wrapped them beautifully. And then he knocked on the door and spoke to the guy and offered him the gift and apologized for whatever he'd done wrong. Now, he'd done nothing wrong, okay? But he apologized. So anyway, he went back home. He was in the kitchen having a cup of tea, feeling very relaxed about it. All felt very good. And the old guy came, beaming from ear to ear with his gift unwrapped. And he said, this is the nicest thing anyone has done. He said, everything is forgiven. I mean, pretty amazing, He took the blame. It's and not as a passive aggression. Yes, Benjamin, I know you're the right person. I'm wrong. Not like that. Sincerely. You see, this is where you understand karma. This is often what happens. We don't understand there's two ways that karma ripens. One way that karma ripens is we're born with our particular tendencies. And another way is we get experiences at the hands of others. And this is this kind of suffering, when you're seen and treated badly by others. But equally, when you're seen and treated well by others, that's also due to your virtuous karma. But this is where so much suffering happens, where we're accused and abused and people don't see us properly or treat us badly, criticize us, etc., etc. This is very common. So then, I lost my plot there. What was I saying? Anyway. This is the toughest practice. This is the most intense practice. Accept the blame. But it's hard because the instinct is not that. The instinct, the second we're accused, the second instinctively attachment arises, aversion arises, and then depending on our personality, we'll shout and yell, or we'll have passive aggression, or get depressed. But instinctively, ego rises just like that, automatically. It's so primordial. So that's why I have to do this kind of practice. You've got to be watching your mind like a hawk. Most of us aren't capable of doing this because instantly ego rises and we get offended and upset and how dare you, and I'm innocent, But to actually think that's a good response. But that's how karma is. John had done nothing wrong in this life, but this is what happens when people accuse us of something. It's because of having done it in the past life and they see us as lying. You might be telling the truth, but someone never believes your words. That's because of lying in the past. So what happens to us now, how people mistreat us and accuse us wrongly or say we're lying or stealing, and they believe it. We didn't do anything wrong now. It's because of past actions like that. So they see us in that way. So this fellow imagine what John had done. He was convinced. So John accepted. And it happened to work. It was like a bonus, you know. It's profound. Now the next one, even worse. This is closest to home. This is like your daughter or your son or your beloved. I think this next one, you listen. When somebody I have benefited, it's like your beloved, for sure, your child, and in whom I have great hopes, gives me terrible harm, I will regard them as my holy guru. This is the hardest practice. This is, you know, the number of people who come with their problems, you know, and those parents especially, whose children have completely rejected them, hate them, turned against them, never speak to them again. This is the pain I can't even imagine, you know. I can't even bear it. It's too painful. Or people who've sacrificed their life for their partner and they come home to a note, I've left you, you know. After years of trying to just, I mean, I can't, this is a pain I can't imagine. That kind of pain, I'll see them as my holy guru. Of course, it's the point. If you're trying to practice, if you're trying to smash ego, that's your practice, baby. It's intense. I mean, don't take them lightly, but we've got to see the logic behind these, which is why Heather's questions are so good. It's the basis of understanding the first and second scopes of practice. And if we don't understand that, we don't understand this. It's completely right. So question, so what? As she said, so what? We can't hear it, you know. In other words, the analogy for Catherine's a good example. She's reading the paper. She's a doctor, let's say, and she's reading the paper and she reads about some terrible car accident. She can't go there, Heather. The car accident's in Australia, for God's sake, but it will energize her. Oh my God, look at the suffering. I must keep learning that course on how I can help broken legs. Do you see what I'm trying to say, Heather? And then you help where you can. It should inspire you. You see the suffering and you just don't go, oh yeah, look at that. Thank God I'm not near me. I don't have to bother. No, it increases your wish to keep getting better at being a doctor so you can heal all these people one step at a time. That's the point. You see the point, Heather? That's the logic, darling. And that's, of course, it's a brave attitude. You've got to have such a courageous attitude, you know. This is so huge an attitude. Time is at 8:30, okay. You're the only center I have in my time zone. Usually on my calendar, it's so complicated. I have to have, you know, especially Australia, you know, Saturday morning in Australia is like 6 p.m. Friday for me. So I've got to constantly having to manipulate my calendar. It's really complicated, I tell you. Why, you know, I had to give a talk to IKEA. Some managers at IKEA, one woman who met me in Sweden, she rang me and she asked me to do a talk for their managers, and they all have these big meetings, and all the managers from all over the world on Zoom, not Zoom, they use another method. And it was 3 a.m. And she said, oh yeah, they're all used to it. So I had to go about 2:30 in the morning to give a talk to IKEA. So I've got these weird times. I've got to give a teaching in India at 6:30 in the morning. So I'm getting quite used to these odd hours, but it's only a 2-second walk to my little Zoom room here, you know, so not climbing on airplanes. So I'm quite content. So the next verse, there are more verses. The next two are more, the next one. That's interesting, yeah. Verse 7 is where Tong Len comes from, I'd say. This practice, which is this key practice. I mean, I've leapt over all the, from equanimity to up here, we've missed about 7 points, and that was purposeful because we're focusing on the transforming problems component. So this verse 7, I think, is the source of this Tong Len practice. So Tong Len means giving and taking, giving, Tibetans are very efficient. They don't have and and the. This is nouns, verbs. So this Tong Len, so what it says is, in short, both directly and indirectly, I offer every happiness and benefit. Mine. I offer all my good things. I offer all my happiness, all my wealth, all my health, all my good things. I offer to my kind mothers. That's the giving part. Then the taking part is the next one. And I will secretly take upon myself all their harmful actions and suffering. So this is, as we know, this is sort of formalized in a little meditation practice. And I find it very surprising that a lot of Western people love this practice. So fascinating. So basically what you're doing, you're visualizing in front of you in a meditation. There's many ways you can do it. People spend years and years in retreat doing all the realms of existence, you know. So what you'd start saying, you know, you'd start and you'd visualize like your beloved friend who's got a headache. You'd visualize them in front of you. So what you do is you're using your breath. It's an attitude, but you're using your breath in a meditation. It's very nice. So then you're visualizing at your heart, let's say, is one way of doing it, like a little rock, which is your self-cherishing, your self-centeredness, you know. You're visualizing your friend. So the first thing you do is you breathe in, and you imagine you're breathing in their suffering. You're breathing it off them like yucky smoke, and you're breathing it into yourself. And you imagine smashing your self-cherishing. You're chipping away at your self-cherishing. And when you breathe out, you're breathing out radiant light, and you're imagine giving them health, giving them your happiness, giving them all your things, whatever you want, giving them all your merit, giving them your possessions, whatever it might be. So it's an outrageous opposite to normal view. And it's the essence of this whole approach. So first of all, this is not a healing technique. There are lots of ways to do healing, like medicine Buddha and all kinds of things. This is not a healing technique. And again, you know, Dana's point, this is to help you smash your self-cherishing so you can become a Buddha as quickly as possible, so you can benefit others. It's a method, becoming the best doctor. So what you're trying to do is the other thing you're not trying to do, absolutely not trying to do, is take away the headache, get the headache yourself. That's plain ridiculous. Like you're breathing in, I've got to get a headache, That's just totally nonsense. It's meaningless. It's not like that at all. You're not even trying to heal their headache. You're using this example of a person with a headache as an object of a person who's got suffering. And you're thinking, if I could, I would rather have the headache than them. Parents have that for their children. I hear it, you know. I wish I could have that disease, parents say. That's the attitude. That's exactly what Tonglen is. Such empathy, such compassion that you find their suffering so unbearable that you would rather they be happy and you would rather have the suffering because you can handle it. And that's for sure not a victim mind. You've got to be able, like it's like nothing for you, you know. That's outrageous, you think about it. So okay, what's even compassion? Think about it. Like I said, basic compassion is the thought, may you not suffer. And remember, we're talking the three kinds of suffering here, not just being sick, first kind, all kinds of suffering. And that's why having compassion for Mr. Trump or the psychopath is because they're not just even now, like she said, in their head, that's suffering. That's the minor part. The real reason for having compassion for people who harm others is because they're creating future suffering for themselves. I told the story, I think, last week. I'm sure I did, I might have, of these young nuns when Richard Gere invited His Holiness the Dalai Lama to New York in 2003. And he invited a bunch of former prisoners, all of whom had done some kind of meditation in prison. And then people like me were invited because we were working with people in prison. So it was a very moving day, all these prisoners, American prisoners, talking about their suffering, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then he invited these two young Tibetan nuns. Did I mention the story last week? No, okay. So anyway, these two young Tibetan nuns who'd been in prison, tortured, sexually abused for a couple of years. And they were just telling their story. And this is a very powerful example of all these things I'm talking about. I'll try and express. So these young women, first of all, was very evident to the Americans. And the Americans is a whole cross-section, black, white, male, female, Puerto Rican, Mexican, you know, all of whom had had long years in prison, sometimes really intense suffering. These places are pretty garbage dumps. And just dealing with all their pain, their suffering, the racism, you know, all this stuff, talking about their suffering. Lovely people. I had a wonderful meeting with His Holiness. And these two young women, it was fairly evident, I think, to everybody else, if you want to quantify suffering, they've been tortured and sexually abused for a couple of years. I mean, they were little innocent little girls. I mean, they don't even hurt flies, you know. They were arrested and tortured because they were supposed to be enemies, but because they were Buddhists, right? So they were telling their experiences and there were tears. Well, the first thing that was very clear, I think, to all the Americans there is that they weren't angry. And this is something I think is really important to talk about. It's very powerful, the logic of anger, the philosophy of anger. We don't think of it like this in our culture. We've got to unpack these delusions. This is what being Buddhist means. You've got to unpack all these assumptions, you know, they're all false, they're all rubbish. So What is anger? Analyze what anger is. What are the words of anger? If Benjamin hurts me, the anger is this outrage, and it will say, it's saying, how dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. That's anger. Do we agree with that in general? It's a powerful concept. Well, let's analyze. And this is wisdom wing. This is wisdom wing. This is how you prepare yourself for the compassion wing. So let's analyze that assumption. Well, if I'm really trying to practice, I'm practicing with my relationship with Benjamin. Anger is a completely meaningless concept. It's completely based upon attachment, the deeper delusion that this bottomless pit, this gigantic assumption, this totally self-centered, this hubris, this entitlement. Attachment is I only deserve good things. Analyze this. That's what attachment is. And anger is, how dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. Well, if you have the view of karma alone, these are nonsense concepts. If you really have the view of karma, and I met people who are Tibetans for whom karma is just the natural view they've had in their culture for 1,000 years, 1,200 years. It's just in their bones, you know. So they don't have anger. I'm not saying people don't have anger in Tibet. Like Dalai Lama said, he's so sad now. More and more Tibetans have anger because they're giving up the view of karma, you know. But if you have the view that you created the cause for all your happiness in past lives, and if you have the view that you created the suffering in your past lives, when you really have karma down, experientially, not just intellectually, then of course you wouldn't have attachment and anger. It would counteract attachment and anger, because the hubris, the entitlement of attachment is so outrageous. Why do we assume we only deserve good things? I think it's better to be more truthful and say, I only want the good things. That's true. But where does this view that I deserve? You know, it's like looking in your bank and you see no dollars there. And you say, how dare there be no dollars in my bank? I deserve dollars. People would laugh at you and listen to the reason. Because it's your bank account, and we know what's in your bank account is what you put there. And if you didn't put dollars, it is bizarre to assume someone else should do it. But that's the view of ego. We think we're these innocent victims who didn't ask to get born, and our mother and father made us, and so they better be perfect. That's why we think our mother should be perfect. How dare she be a bad mother? That's the hubris and arrogance and entitlement of attachment. That's our main suffering. It's this junkie in us. It's got no logic at all. So if you take responsibility for your bank account, you would never say, I deserve dollars. If you deserve dollars, it's because you've earned them. So we deserve, in this word, they don't use that word deserve. It's so heavy. We use it. So we deserve whatever we get. That sounds too heavy for us, but that's the truth. If you don't work and you just spend up all your money, you deserve to be without dollars. It's heavy to say it, but it's a fact. If you don't look in your garden and say, who put weeds in my garden? I don't deserve weeds. People would laugh at you because it's your garden. What's in it is what you put there. That's karma. So these young women have that in their bones. They know why there is suffering. So that means for them, there's never that thought, which is all we ever have, and we can't get past it. Why is this happening to me? I don't deserve it. That's what anger is. And it's based on the attachment that I only deserve good. They're complete fabrications. They are all rooted in ego grasping. They are nonsense misconceptions. This is kind of intense, but this is the logic of Buddhist teachings. So the young women were not angry, but because they knew why they were suffering. So they were able to deal with it as long as they were in prison. And then the point I'm getting at, and then they said, one of them said, and there were tears, you know, and one of them said, and of course, we had compassion for our torturers. And this is the point too, Heather, whether it's Mr. Trump or not, it might be your boyfriend. Of course, we had compassion for our torturers because we know we harmed them in the past. And most of all, because we know they will suffer terribly in the future. That's the real basis of compassion. So first of all, there's a strong karmic connection. So if I'm trying to practice in my relationship and I've made a decision, this is a worthwhile relationship. I'm not just being a victim, you know. Like Oprah, I heard Oprah say recently that the commonest thing she hears women say, well, he's better than nothing. So most people stay in their miserable relationship because it's better than nothing. This is the most awful thing. So if I've made a conscious decision that Benjamin's a good relationship, then I've got to work on it, then I'm going to practice accepting that whatever Benjamin does to me, including all the good things, it's mine coming back to me. As Lama Zopa says, karma's like everything is our own karmic appearance. Whatever arises, whatever comes in front of us, we created it. This is emptiness, really. It's a completely different view of the universe. This is wisdom wing and compassion wing. A friend of mine, another Tibetan friend, told me about how he was in 87, was the first it's like the mini uprising since 59. And all the monks and nuns were the ones who were demonstrating, right? And he was involved in that. 17, all these demonstrations, got arrested, and his friend had his head blown off, and he got imprisoned, and he got out again. And then he thought he'd better escape. So he came to Nepal, and he was at Courtin Monastery. And he was telling me about all this suffering. Since he left, his father got murdered, brother got murdered. He was in tears in his eyes. And I said to him very casually, I said, this is like 30 years ago. I said, Jigdal, do you ever get angry? And he laughed. He just laughed very casually. He said, Robina, what for? It's our own fault. And that's the simplest meaning of karma. He didn't give this long philosophical lecture about karma. He just meant, what do you mean angry when you know you created yourself? Why would I get angry if there's no money in my bank? Because I did it. Why would I be angry that there are weeds in my garden? Because I put them there. So anger would be a silly response. He understood it deeply and psychologically. He wasn't angry, but he was sad. So anger is powerful to understand, and it's rooted in attachment, which is even more powerful to understand. And they're the symptoms of a demented person. That's us. It's called samsara. Buddha calls it samsara. This is why we suffer, and this is why sentient beings suffer. So until I know my suffering, I can't begin to have compassion for others. Not possible. So, Tonglen. So first of all, there's compassion. Oh my God, look at that suffering. And then there's the unique characteristic of the compassion of the Bodhisattva path, which is called great compassion. And then they even call special attitude. There's like two parts of it. So great compassion, this is the unique characteristic of the Bodhisattva path that says, what can I do to fix it? That's the point, Heather. That's the next one. That's a good point. She said, so what? Then you go, what can I do? You say when you see that suffering, what can I do? You see a car accident, what can I do? If you can do something, do it. But if you can't, you don't just go, oh, who cares? You go, I must learn, like Catherine analogy, I must learn how to heal people so I can then help them. And that's the compassion to become a Buddha who is totally qualified to help every living being in the universe. That's the whole point. That's the motivation. So great compassion is the really powerful one of the Bodhisattva. It's the individual responsibility, the universal responsibility. It's my job, So then Tonglen is like another kind of icing on the top. So not only is, oh my God, look at that person with a headache. That's compassion. Then it's, what can I do to take it away? But more than that, you know what, honey? Give it to me. I'd rather have the suffering. That's Tonglen. I mean, you can't take away the headache, but if you could, you would. It's the willingness, it's the wishing, the wanting, the rather. This is outrageous attitude, So, one step at a time. So the final verse, verse 8. There's no time for this one. Maybe we'll do that next week. We'll do the verse 8 next week. Any questions? Time to finish soon. I'm running out of voice. Got all this yuck. Any more questions? Huh? People? No? Well, let's do a little meditation. I mean, we could do Tonglen, but I think you've got to do it your own. Do your own Tonglen yourself, I think. Maybe we'll finish a bit early. I'm running out of voice. So we just do 3 minutes of watching our mind, okay? Concentration. From Mahamudra. We did it last week. Just decide, you're going to sit there being really natural, and you're determined to have focus. You're determined to pay attention to whatever crazy thoughts arise. And you mind your own business. You let them come like a bunch of crazy roommates shouting and yelling. Let them come and let them go. Don't try to attack them. Don't try to wish they weren't there. Don't try to understand them. Don't try and have a dialogue with them. Just let them come and let them go. It's a very powerful practice, training ourselves not to get involved in every thought, you know. So just close your eyes and pay attention to your thoughts with determination to stay focused. Just keep your attention sharp. Stay very sharp and focused, not spaced out. So we finish with the 4 immeasurable thoughts, these amazing aspirations of the Bodhisattva. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings could abide in equanimity, free of attachment, hatred, or attachment, anger, and ignorance. May they abide so. And now the brave attitude of the Bodhisattva. I will make this happen. Please, Guru Buddha, bless me to be able to do this. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings could be free of suffering and its causes. May they be free. I will make this happen. Please, Guru Buddha, bless me to be able to do this. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings could have happiness and its causes. May they have them. I will make this happen. Please, Guru Buddha, bless me to be able to do this. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were never parted from higher rebirths and liberation's excellent bliss. May they never be parted. I will make this happen. Please, Guru Buddha, bless me to be able to do this. All right, finish with that thought. And then think, try and act like bodhisattvas, because we're on the bodhisattva path here in these classes. So try and think like the rest of the day and tomorrow. Think, you know, we tend to think there's just this big fat lump of me plodding through life, right? But we've got body, we have speech, and we have mind. So try and act like the bodhisattvas who consciously are conscious that their body and speech is only for the sake of others. Try and think like this. It makes you much more conscious that if you're walking down the street, you're talking to people, you're there for their sake. But your mind, that's your business. Train like that. Try and help like that. That's the bodhisattva approach. Do our best, you know. Watch your mind like a hawk and avert the delusions as soon as they arise. Okay, that's it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for all your questions. Very helpful.
Thank you, Venerable Robina.
Jang Chup Sem Trog Rinpoche, Ma Ke Panam, Ke Guchi, Ke Panyam Pa Me Payam, Gong Ne Gong Du Paba Shog, Gewa Di, Nudo Dag Lama Sange Drup Yone, Drowa Tikyang Malu Pa, De Sala Gurpa Shog. And just delight and rejoice. We've 2 hours nearly. All these thoughts we've had, all these seeds we've planted. May they ripen exactly as we motivated. To me, become a Buddha so I can benefit others. No matter how long it takes, doesn't matter. Okay, darlings. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Bye. Thanks, darlings. And thank you from Laguna Beach. Hello, Laguna Beach. I saw you there. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.